Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Mariam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. It was the middle of May of 1968 when Wilbur Riddle of Georgetown, Kentucky stumbled upon a canvas bundle while scavenging for glass insulators alongside Route 25. At a closer look, Mr. Riddle realized that the bundle of tarpaulin was actually hiding the decomposing body of a young female that would become known as the Tent Girl. The police investigation was unfruitful, failing to produce a suspect or an identification of the young woman's body. She would eventually be buried in a Georgetown cemetery with a donated headstone and her police composite sketch engraved on it. Fast forward a few decades later, with the determination of one of Wilbur Riddle's relatives, the body is finally identified. Here with us today is one of our favorite guests, Wayne Johnson, to give us the details of this unsolved murder case. Hi, Wayne. Welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, it's great. Great to be here.
Our favorite guest. Definitely. Oh. Well, every single topic that you ever talk about is always so fascinating, but this one in particular about the murder mystery of what was known as the Tent Girl. This was a famous murder mystery that was featured on a TV show called Who Killed Jane Doe, that the body was found here around Lexington in Georgetown, to be specific. And you have the details of that story. So tell us a little bit about Tent Girl, where she was found.
Okay. Well, let me go back to 1998. Now, on April 25th, 1998, a funeral of a woman took place in the Georgetown Cemetery in Scott County. And there was about 60 mourners, and the woman's three sisters were there and her two daughters, and there were reporters there. And one person who attended the funeral was quoted in the newspaper the following day on the reason why she attended this funeral for a person that she had never met. And she said the following: "It's just something we, meaning all of Scott County, owe her. We know her and she's part of us." This person, along with many of the mourners at that funeral, had never met this woman, but yet they had a very strong emotional attachment to her, and they came to pay their respects. Now, who was this woman who evoked such feelings that these people would want to come to her funeral? This funeral was reported widely and brought to a conclusion a mystery that had baffled many for decades. The long 30-year journey of the Tent Girl, that's what this person was referred to. The Tent Girl was finally over. Her long journey was finally over. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the story. Now, the headline of the Lexington Herald-Leader on Saturday, May 18th, 1968, read as follows. Front page story. Tarped, wrapped nude body is found in Scott. The decomposed nude body of a young white woman wrapped in a tarpaulin.
Mm-hmm. Like a tarpaulin, yeah.
We'll
like
go tarp. The tarp.
Let's make it easy.
Yeah. Tied with a twine, on both ends, was found. And this was about 13 miles north of here, and it was on a Friday morning. And this is how the legendary mystery of the Tent Girl began. On Friday, May 17th, 1968, the day before, a well driller by the name of Wilbur Riddle, last name Riddle, which is an appropriate last name for this particular story because it definitely was a riddle for decades. He was collecting glass insulators that telephone workers were replacing with cable off US 25 near the Sadieville, Kentucky turnoff. It was very close to the Interstate 75. And when he was collecting these glass insulators, he came across a tarp lying in a field beside a fence and below a rock ledge. And Riddle, thinking he could salvage this tarp, kicked it. And it caused it to roll down a 30-foot embankment, according to the newspaper articles. It was only then that he saw a body folded inside the tarp. The Tent Girl had been discovered. Of course, he contacted the authorities immediately, and they came and they finally concluded that the wrapped body had been in the field beside the fence for some 2 to 3 weeks. That's what they said at the start. And of course, they checked missing persons reports and other evidence that could potentially identify this girl that was found, but they could not determine the girl's identity. Now, keep in mind, this is way before DNA and the internet and so forth.
There's a lot of the technology, the investigative technology that we currently have is not available back then, obviously.
Yes.
So,
and if we never had that technology, the tent girl never would have been identified, probably. So anyway, there was no items of jewelry, clothing fragments, shoes, etc., that were found on her. So that might possibly ID her. And it's like the question was, who was this girl, this tent girl? Now, during my research, I was curious about who decided to call her the tent girl. Well, the reason why is because she was found in a tent-like tarp. But back in those days, the Kentucky Post newspaper up in northern Kentucky, these kind of cases really caught their attention, and they would come down and do some investigating, even though their coverage didn't really cover all Kentucky. Yeah. Whenever they saw a good mystery, they got involved in it. The Wayne murder here in Lexington in 1965 is a great example of how, the Kentucky Post reported things that the local newspapers didn't quite get to. So they had a very investigative style of reporting. When they saw a good mystery, they jumped on it. Legend has it that the editor at the time liked to give monikers or nicknames or whatever the case is. And the story goes that he was probably
something that we would consider clickbait now, or just the big catchy headlines.
And the story goes that he's the one that came up with the term tent girl. And when I was looking on newspapers.com last week, actually just a couple of days ago, the Kentucky Post definitely had more stories about her. And actually, there was a story like 4 or 5 days after she was found, and this headline was "The Tent Girl." So it looks like the Kentucky Post can be credited with coming up with that term. Well, anyway, she was found. Nobody knew who she was. They checked all the missing persons in the area and the state, and they just couldn't ID her. And who she was, it was a question that would haunt central Kentucky for decades. Now, the tent girl was buried in an unmarked grave in the Georgetown Cemetery in Scott County. And in 1972, a man who would eventually become the county coroner, Marvin Yoakum, donated a gravestone to mark her grave. The gravestone had an image of the dead girl, the best they could come up with.
So like a police sketch based on the bone structure of the body. And
the following inscription was on the gravestone. Tent girl, found May 17th, 1968, on U.S. Highway 25 North. Died about April 26th through May 3rd, 1968. Age about 16 to 19 years. Height 5 feet 1 inch, weight 110 to 115 pounds, reddish brown hair, and at the bottom of the inscription, unidentified. And this gravestone remained like that for 30 years. Now, over the years, people would visit the grave and leave flowers and light candles in honor of the tent girl. There was a lady in Scott County, maybe a tourism person, who would take groups out to visit the cemetery and do tours out there, including school tours, because the cemetery was noted for the prominent people in the cemetery, like governors of Kentucky and Confederate governors, what have you. But she said, she was quoted in the newspaper later, the school kids would always gravitate toward the tent girl gravestone. That was the one that caught their attention. Now, I grew up here in Lexington, and I got to admit, I had never heard of the tent girl until I started working at the Lexington Public Library in the early 1990s. And I do remember the first time I heard about it, a customer, and I'm pretty sure it was a phone call. a customer called up and asked about the tent girl. And I'm like, tent girl, never heard of her, And so we did some investigating here in the Kentucky room. And this was years before she was eventually identified, and did some research for her. I think we started a vertical vial on her and put her in the local history index. But again, nobody knew who she was or what happened to her. They concluded, of course, she was murdered, because, find a body in a field and wrapped up in a tarp, but they couldn't determine her cause of death, and including and also her identity. So they don't know how she died. So to me, I'm not an expert but that would mean she probably didn't die of a gunshot wound or maybe a knife wound, but the body was so decomposed when it was found, but they could not determine.
Do we know how long the investigation took? Like, how long did they spend on this? When was it just they closed as a cold case?
I don't. I think they kept it open, but after some time, it's like we're not going to solve this. The person who finally did solve it stated later that he'd been told from authorities that case will probably never be solved. Yeah. And so I think it's like a lot of those type of cases. They probably keep it open, but they don't really have the manpower to go look at it. They looked at it at the time, and once time goes by, it's like, let's put in the back office and
there was no database basically to go back to be like, okay, this is like the missing persons, or this is way before that happened.
And they had checked missing persons list back in the day, and like I said, there wasn't any kind of computer database, and they did send out a description of the woman and how she was found to various places nationwide. So it's not like they just didn't do anything. It's just like nobody knew who this woman was and where she came from. And she wasn't all the missing persons, you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, when I was doing the research for this podcast, there was at one point a mother had come down to check and see if this was her daughter that was missing from, I guess it was Maryland or somewhere up in the Northeast. So she came down and tried to look at the body, and but it was so decomposed that she couldn't positively identify one way or the other if it was her daughter. So it was just deemed that it was not her. So
yeah, I don't know if that's the same woman who came to Georgetown and said the woman, I guess they dug the body up
in the 90s when this gentleman, I'm sure you're going to come to this point, but when he tracked down the family of this missing woman, they had enough evidence to kind of I guess say that it might be this person, so they decided to exhume the body and
well, the one I was thinking of was probably in the 70s or late 60s, where a woman thought it was her daughter, but then when she came, and I guess they had to dig the body up, or maybe they already had the information down, but she knew it wasn't her daughter because her daughter had fake nails, and this person didn't. Yeah. So they ruled her out. And like we mentioned earlier, this crime took place, several years before the internet and DNA was available. So unless somebody came forward with conclusive evidence of who this tent girl was, there's a good chance that the tent girl would forever be anonymous. A very good chance.
Yeah. But that wasn't the case.
No, it wasn't. Wilbur Riddle had even commented later on that the fact he found the tent girl when he did was pure luck. Not that finding a murder victim is luck, but he was referring to the fact that she was found below a stone ledge, and the stone ledge eventually collapsed, and it would have been right over her body, and it never would have been found. So, and like most murders are like whodunit. Well, this was a who is it? Who killed the tent girl was not as important as who the tent girl was. And I think that's how the authorities approached it over the years. Now let's fast forward to 1998, and DNA and the internet had arrived on the scene. Wilbur Riddle had a son-in-law by the name of Todd Matthews, and he had learned of the case from Riddle, his father-in-law, sometime in the late 1980s. I think he was like a teenager at the time. And he began looking into the case. And, according to newspaper articles at the time, he made it his personal crusade to solve the identity of the tent girl. He wanted to do this so that his father-in-law would have closure. And in early 1988, as Matthews continued his search for the tent girl's ID, he noticed a missing persons listing on the internet that a woman by the name of Rosemary Westbrook had posted from, she lived down in, I think Benton, Arkansas. And Matthews was looking at this missing person, and he noticed the similarities between this woman's description and the tent girls.
Yeah, sketch.
Yeah. And so eventually Westbrook and Todd Matthews got together, communicated through email or over the internet. And eventually there was enough of a similarity that, they got the Scott County Sheriff's Department involved in it, saying, hey, this might be a potential break in the case. And of course, the law enforcement skeptical, but anyway, they collected information from Westbrook about her sister. Again, noticed some of the similarities, and they also included or collected DNA from her. And then they exhumed the tent girl's body and took some DNA from her, and they sent the DNA samples to a North Carolina lab. And on April 22nd, 1998, the results were announced. There was a flood of reporters, TV crews from large cities, Cincinnati, Louisville, went to the courthouse. And there were even, and there was a big news conference, and there were even national media, including CBS 48 Hours and ABC's 2020. They were going to do a national story on the tent girl. And the announcement that was made was that there was a DNA match between Miss Westbrook and the tent girl. The tent girl's sister, she had 4 sisters, and they were always, they put out missing persons reports on her, but they never realized she lived in Lexington, according to them. And apparently they were told by the husband of the tent girl that she just up and left. And but that didn't keep them from trying to find out where she went.
So what did Miss Westbrook say, give information about her sister?
The type of information?
Yeah, like what did she describe the situation?
Well, I think, like she said, she just described what the husband had told her. It was basically, she had vanished off the face of the earth. They looked and they looked, and this brings me, I wasn't going to talk about this, but this brings me to my, what I call my Uncle Billy theory of investigation. Years ago, I can't resist this. Years ago, I did a tour of the various Lexington Public Library locations and did a talk on unsolved cases. And I came up with this Uncle Billy theory on how cases can be solved. And most of us who watch movies has probably watched It's a Wonderful Life. And in It's a Wonderful Life, Uncle Billy loses the money, and George Bailey, is, where's the money, Uncle Billy? And Uncle Billy told him, I don't know. And they retraced his steps, and he told George Bailey, everything he did with one exception. And that exception was he had met Mr. Potter before the money disappeared. Now, if he told George Bailey this, George Bailey would have automatically said, well, heck, Potter has the money. Let's go get that money back. But he didn't give that information, in the movie. It would have kind of destroyed a good movie. But it's the same concept.
It's a little detail.
Yeah, and I told the crowds before I got into my Uncle Billy theory, I said, now don't laugh at this, because I knew they would. But I said, it makes a lot of sense. The concept's the same. That one piece of information. I met Potter when I had the money. It would have solved the case. And it works the same way with cases like this. Just one little bit of information. In this case, it was Todd Matthews and Miss Westbrook hooking up over the internet and noticing things. But the sisters really, did make an effort to find her. But, you know how family sometimes separates, and it's a big country, and
there wasn't the internet back then to keep in communication.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, Matthews really made this a crusade to get it solved. And he's the hero of this case, solving the case. If it wasn't for him, it probably never would have been solved. Can't say that for sure. But now what threw a lot of investigators off was that the girl that was found, the tent girl, originally they said she was like younger, maybe 16 to 18. And the tent girl, when she was identified, would have been 24 at the time. So that I think threw some people off. But
it seems like from the description that the investigators had that she was a pretty petite woman. So that could have thrown them off as to the age. And
I think the similarities that Matthews noticed with Westbrook's description, they mentioned a small gap in the front teeth. And I think when he saw that, along with some other similarities, he was pretty sure that he had this solved. People that get involved with these kind of things, they just have an innate ability to say, oh, this is it. It's like working a reference question here at the library. It's like, gosh darn it, this is the answer. And I think he had that ability to say, oh, it's got to be this woman. So anyway, he helped solve the case, and it was revealed that the name of the tent girl was a lady who was born in 1943 in Illinois by the name of Barbara Hackman spelled with two N's at the end, Taylor. Apparently she disappeared here in Lexington on December 6, 1967.
Okay.
Give or take it.
So several months before she was found.
Yes. And like I said, the husband claims she just ran out on him. And so he moved the kids to Ohio. And a story in the newspaper was that the oldest daughter, who was the tent girl's, Miss Hackman's stepdaughter, had said that Taylor, the husband, Earl Taylor, and Barbara Hackman Taylor argued a lot. And then on the morning that she disappeared, they had an argument. The stepdaughter went to school. She got back from school, and Barbara Hackman Taylor wasn't there, and the father put him in a car, packed him up, and went up to Ohio.
Mm-hmm. So she had a stepdaughter from, I guess it was his daughter from a previous marriage / relationship. We don't know.
Yeah.
And then she also had a daughter with him. Okay.
Apparently Barbara Hackman met Earl Taylor because she was the babysitter for his daughter. And they met that way, and then they got married. Then she had two more children, a son who eventually, way before she had been identified, he had died in a car wreck or something.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, the stepdaughter was still there. She was like 7 or 8 at the time. And then the other daughter was 7 or 8 months old. Of course, she didn't remember any of that. Both of the daughters were at the funeral. And 3 of the 4 sisters were there. Like I said, many of the Scott County residents who went to visit the grave, it was very comforting to the sisters that Scott County adopted the tent girl when she was in the cemetery, and they would go, like I said, go visit.
They didn't forget her.
They did not forget her. They would put flowers on the grave, light candles, and like I mentioned, the school kids would gravitate toward the grave during the school tours. And when it was finally revealed who the tent girl was, there was some thought that, well, maybe they're going to take her out of the cemetery and bury her somewhere else. And one resident had commented, well, you can put her name on the tombstone, but leave the story here. She's just a part of all of us. And that was how a lot of people felt in Scott County, that the tent girl was their sister or their daughter or their, mother. So there's that, like I mentioned early in the podcast, there was a emotional attachment with the community in the tent girl's grave. It was amazing that it was ever solved, and I don't think you can say enough about the work Todd Matthews did with this. He started when he was like 17 or 18, and
then he had this almost like an obsession to find.
Yeah, nothing wrong with an obsession if if it's a productive. And he was obsessed with it. And if he wasn't, the case
would never have been solved. Yeah. So do we know what happened to her? Like, who did it? I know that wasn't necessarily the focus, but
when the story was broke about who she was, immediately the suspicions went toward the husband, because he's the one who told the sisters, hey, she ran off, never came back. And also, since she was found in a tent-like canvas, he was a carnival worker who traveled around, and she would travel around with him. So they kind of put two and two together, but they never could tie down any evidence that said, well, this is what happened to her and this is who did it. And like I mentioned earlier, I think everybody, since the husband died in 1987, 11 years before she was identified, I think, people just said, just let it, don't think it was ever solved about whether he did it. And I hate to say this guy did it, because I don't know,
Yeah, nobody really knows.
Yeah, maybe she did run off, and maybe whoever she ran off with did something to her. I don't know, but it's mighty suspicious.
Mm-hmm. Now, the tent, the fabric that she was wrapped in was known to be used in those circus type.
I think so. Yeah. I never ran across a story that said, that was the type of tent that they used in a carnival or a circus, but they did use those type of things and they traveled around. She was working at a restaurant here in Lexington when she disappeared. And I was trying to think back, they would have carnivals up at the Eastland Shopping Center, once or twice a year. So we'd go up there and go to those. And I kind of wondered, well, maybe he was working one of those carnivals.
You never know.
Yeah. But I would never, and the authorities never took the leap to say, this is the guy that did it.
Well, it didn't seem like he had connections to the community. And so nobody would say, like, yeah, I remember this man. Or
I think the only indirect evidence is the fact that the stepdaughter said they had an argument that morning, and she came home and she was nowhere to be found. So that would raise suspicions to me.
Yeah, there's still a lot of questions. Obviously, like some of the research that I've done, we still don't know who the first woman that he had the relationship with, the mother of the stepdaughter. Okay. So nobody really knows what happened to her either. Oh. So there's still a lot of questions about this man and that she was married to. So it's, in a lot of ways, it's still unsolved, but at least we have a name to this woman that's buried in Georgetown.
And I think it was Rosemary Westbrook, who mentioned at the time that the fact she was identified was basically good enough for them. So I think that they kind of had the thoughts of maybe the husband did it, and he's been dead for 10 years after. And now they did, and I think that's very noteworthy. When they did the gravestone, they put Barbara Hackman.
They left his...
Yeah. I think I saw...
They left her married name out?
No, they left her married name out.
Out, yeah.
Yeah, but I remember seeing a gravestone that had Barbara Hackman Taylor, but maybe they redid it. But that kind of led me to think, well, maybe they think that he had... I mean, his actions were very suspicious, to say the least. But the key here is, they finally got her identified. Wilbur Riddle finally got the riddle solved, excuse the pun.
Yeah, it's stories like these that kind of, it is a sad ending, but at least, you take your comfort where you can find it, especially for the families.
I think so too. Now, if the husband was still living, I think they would have
pursued that route a little bit more.
Yes, I think they would have. But the newspaper article said, when he was dying, he died in 1987. He died relatively young, but he had told his daughters, he repeated the stories to his daughters that she just left us, So if you're on your deathbed or close to it, you would think people would come clean about that, but who knows how people like that think.
Didn't seem compelled to.
But the tent girl was a fascinating case, and unfortunately, there's many unidentified people out there.
Yes, unfortunately. And there's been a lot of reporting about her specifically, just because it is such a fascinating story. So, and thank you for sharing her story with us and with our listeners. You've been listening to our podcast on the tent girl, otherwise known as Barbara Hackman
Taylor.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Mariam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.